This is Troy Brownfield, staff writer for the Saturday Evening Post. Today we're going to talk about our favorite scary movies based on true events. You know, it's easy enough to dismiss supernatural stories of things like werewolves and vampires, but when you're alone, in the dark, thinking about what's right outside your window, sometimes there's nothing more frightening than the real world. The Amityville Horror. Based on a true incident from 1974, the Amityville Horror found fame based on a book from 1977 and a film series that began in 1979. The story is about a real-life series of murders that took place in a house on Long Island, and it stayed famous based on all of the different interpretations of it. The case even involved Ed and Lorraine Warren, the famous spiritual investigators that you'll be hearing about from us more. Over time, the reputation of Amityville has only increased. A lot of people said that it was scary precisely because it happens to a house, so that real people who had invested in their properties and their homes were even more terrified, not just because of hauntings or things that might have happened, but they got to see a family go down in financial ruin in really uncertain economic times. Maybe the most frightening thing about the Amityville case in general is the fact that Mr. DeFeo, the original resident of the house, did in fact murder his entire family with a shotgun. We mentioned Ed and Lorraine Warren, the famous spiritual investigators, and they even have a whole museum dedicated to the cases that the Warrens went on. One of the more famous cases was one that happened in Rhode Island, and that became the basis for the movie The Conjuring. It's this tale of haunting and possession, and while various people have tried to say that it didn't happen, the Warrens have always insisted that all of the cases that they investigated were really happening to the people involved. In fact, the Warrens' cases have been so popular that they are a whole movie universe unto themselves now, based on all the various things that they've investigated, from the doll Annabelle to the more recent film The Nun. It's okay if you're skeptical about the cases that the Warrens investigated, but today, Lorraine is still alive and still runs the investigative museum, and you can even see the real doll that was the basis for Annabelle. The 2003 film Open Water is another that's based on a real case that is almost too frightening to really think about. In the film, as in real life, a couple who was on a diving tour got left behind and came face to face with a very large group of very hungry sharks. Even if you haven't seen it, I don't think we need to tell you exactly how this one ends, but anyone that has a fear of the ocean in general and sharks in particular is advised to probably steer very, very clear of it. Maybe the most disturbing thing about the story depicted in Open Water is that the bodies were never found, although we have a pretty good idea where they ended up. In the late 1950s, when Robert Bloch started writing the story that would be the basis for the book Psycho and the basis for the film, little did he know that in Plainfield, Wisconsin, handyman Ed Gein was committing some of the same kind of murders that he'd be describing. He found out toward the end of writing the book that Ed Gein had been arrested, and about the strange relationship that Gein had with his mother that echoed what he'd already been writing about for Norman Bates. That actually made him and Hitchcock even more excited to get the story on film, because as terrifying as it was, it had a basis in real life. Maybe even worse, some of the elements of the story went on to inspire Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Silence of the Lambs, because Gein was actually using the skin of his victims to make a person suit. I don't know how you could get much worse than that. The 2008 film The Strangers takes some of its inspiration from a real case in the early 80s about a family that was murdered at a cabin. It's called the Cabin 23 case. And what happened was a group of family members on vacation split up. Some went to some parties, some went in town, but some people stayed behind at the cabin. And the next day, when the eldest daughter returned, she found 4 of the family members had been killed overnight. And outside of some vague descriptions from the smallest children that were there and still unharmed, nobody knew exactly what happened. To this day, the case is still being investigated. All they have are a couple of vague sketches and some potential DNA evidence, but original suspects in the case have died, and nobody can actually place who all might have been at the cabin that night at the location. Much like the film, it might have just happened because they happened to be home. So, as much as we might like to reassure ourselves that scary movies and horror movies are all just make-believe, sometimes you have to remember the most terrifying things could be right behind you.